This video is brought to you by Horror, the first time America's paranoia infected the world, my own book on the international war on comic books that occurred during the 1950s, and tries to explain how the modern political world still suffers from incidences from this time. Now, if you like movies like Stand By Me, or Hollywood history like Alfred Hitchcock or Orson Welles and the trouble they had with media censorship of their movies, well, this may well be the book for you. Welcome to Eccentric Adventures, and what we're going to be looking at is the world of documentaries. Reacting to and reviewing films has always been very popular, but not so much about documentaries. And I've kind of noticed that documentary watchers are a breed unto themselves. We love our documentaries. We can watch documentaries at any time of day, and could be about anything, and we'll really get in there and enjoy learning about new things. And I think that's the power of documentaries, is teaching you in a very short time about a subject you may not know anything about. And with that idea, I thought I would start this little experiment with a very special documentary. Now, before we start, I should point out, not all these are going to be like this. I've talked to a bunch of people I know, and we're going to do some conversations. We might even do something akin to movie documentaries, where we'll have a table conversation. We'll have lots of guest speakers, some hopefully famous ones, some very known ones, some that you really want to hear from, about certain subjects like, we'll watch a documentary about dinosaurs, watch a documentary about prehistoric creatures, watch a documentary about comics, and we'll get some comic creators and things. And I think that'll be an exciting way of doing this. But I just want to start with this amazing documentary that I just watched. And I encourage everyone listening to jump on Netflix at the moment and go to find this gem of a program. And I'm hoping it's on international Netflix. One I think you may not be aware of, and if you are, fantastic, well done. And if you're not, you're welcome. I'll say that right from the word go. You're going to love this. This documentary blindsided me, and I believe it reveals how weird the world can be, and yet how hauntingly familiar things can be. We might be watching something about a subject that we know nothing about, and yet through our own life experiences we can look into those lives and we take something from them, because essentially all lives are the same. We've all got hopes and dreams, we've got things we like, things we hate, problems, we've got joys, we've got victories, we've got losses. That's what I think the power of documentaries is. So let me just introduce you to this amazing documentary, and let's start with a bit of music.
Shh! Your attention, please. Settle back and listen. Let's reduce the din. Your A.B. Dick Company pacemaker sales meeting
is about to begin.
Hopefully you are now sitting out there in awe, scratching your head and trying to work out, what the hell did I just hear? No, this is not a documentary about pacemakers. Let me just assure you of that right from the word go. In fact, it's not a documentary about anything, and yet it's a documentary about everything. What you've just heard is a snippet from a 2018 documentary called Bathtubs Over Broadway. And yes, I had to read that. I just want to make sure I got that correct. Now, Bathtubs Over Broadway, and this is true, is a documentary about one man's investigation into the bizarre world of industrial musicals. And on that, let's hear another music quote.
There's a new world opening up. There's a new world opening up. There's a new world opening up for the likes of me and you. There's a new day coming our way. There's a new day coming our way. There's a new day coming our way for the likes of me and you. Anywhere you travel, there's one thing that's the same. You'll always find a well-known sign, and that's the Xerox name. Any kind of language you may speak or hear, one thing sure, you'll find pure Xerox spoken here.
So what's the old saying? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Well, sometimes all the hard work in the world is not going to be enough. And your life can take you in different directions. And believe me, I know that. My life has been a very strange tour of the world and various institutions and places that I've worked. Nothing that I would have thought I would be doing when I was a kid. Or maybe these were things I hoped that I would be doing when I was a kid. Working in comic shops, working in theatres, working in museums, having my own radio show, so to speak. I would have loved knowing all that when I was a kid, and life can take you in strange places. So I feel this documentary is about lost dreams in a hidden world of lost people who we were never supposed to know anything about. So what is an industrial musical, I hear you ask? Well, let's hear from the man himself.
I was working at the Letterman show as a comedy writer. I started finding these mysterious corporate records. Musicals, but about tractors or silicone products. I didn't know anything about musical theater, but I was pretty sure it wasn't supposed to be this.
And the voice you just heard is our narrator in this documentary, a man called Steve Young. And as you can hear, Steve Young, well, he used to be a comedy writer for Letterman. So it's not like he's not known in famous circles and things, and that's obviously one reason he got this documentary made. But it's not really about Steve. It's about Steve's journey. Steve's journey finding this tiny little microcosm of the world that nobody knew anything about, or at least he didn't know anything about. And so as he explored, this world opened up to him and he found it fascinating. And that's pretty much what documentaries do. That's what we hope documentaries do. That's what you want from a documentary. You want to be taken somewhere. You want to go on a journey. You want to learn something. I feel that's one of the powers of a documentary, and one reason why I love them. I love learning about things I'd never even think of learning about and discovering that these things can be quite interesting. So industrial musicals. Well, these were music productions that were never meant to be seen by the general public, but by the employees or maybe even the customers of businesses. And as you'll see in this documentary, they do not have to be big businesses. They do not have to be building the greatest mousetrap on the planet. These products can be anything you can imagine. And often you'll hear that they are. Some of the musicals were for the plastic wrap for butchers that they wrap their meat in. And that company put on a musical for their employees. And that's just amazing. And it kind of makes sense. If you've ever been to a staff meeting, or especially an industry meeting run by industry execs, these things can be rather boring. You'll often have some white-haired old man standing in front of a crowd for an hour, droning on about statistics and production quotas. It's just the most boring thing, and you can understand employees zone out. They work for a living. They don't get a lot of time off. Their brains are filled with other things, and now they're listening to this background buzz. So somewhere along the line, somebody went, well, let's just put in a little pizzazz to make these meetings far more interesting. And that's what an industrial musical is. They would actually go to these companies and they would put on a play, a musical, some sort of production to inform their customers or their employees. And it wasn't just about informing their employees either. It was about a sense of purpose, a sense of pride, that these people often work their whole lives at these businesses. And this was a way of kind of encouraging them and to showing that they were a part of a bigger thing. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that was a big thing. People would join businesses and think that they would spend their entire life working in that production line. It was a career. And most importantly, I feel it was a stable career. My father, my parents, they would look at their job as a stable income so that they could allow them to do things like take out very large mortgages and loans on houses, on cars, on things like that to increase their life standard. And they felt that they were safe enough in doing this by having this stable job that they would always have that money coming through the front door. Today, I don't think that's such a thing. I think the world environment today, nobody's thinking of staying at a single business, maybe not even a single type of employment for more than 10 years maybe. You know, I can't imagine anybody I know, except maybe public servants, staying in the job for such long times. It just doesn't seem to happen anymore. And that's a bit of a loss. I think it's pretty amazing. And so imagine being one of these employees and sitting down to watch this live production at a conference, or maybe on a video network that goes across a closed circuit TV system that allowed all these employees in every location to watch these productions and kind of take this sense of pride away from their own employment. And often it's quite informative that they would be learning something that they may not be aware of. For example, one of the clients they talk about in the documentary was a silicone manufacturer. And is there anything more exciting than silicone? I don't know. But one of the people interviewed in the documentary pointed out that the manufacturer was pointing out to him that there were at least 180 uses for their product. And they wanted every one of those uses to be mentioned in the opening song. And we can hear a bit of it right here.
Cured rubber resins and chemical silicones, knowing what they can do for you will surely change your tone.
On cables in places like nuclear plants, it's the perfect insulation. Holds back moisture and corrosion, holds back oxidation.
Baking pan release, non-toxic stuff for foods. Adhesives on freezer packages to fit your foodstuffs moods.
Electrical varnishes that won't wear off, and glass belted tires too. Heat-proof seal for oven wrap that lets you see right through.
O-rings, baby bottle nipples to help you serve your baby's meals. Caulking for your tub or shower. Electric iron seal.
And as we traveled into space as part of Apollo's plan, silicone was used throughout.
Another giant step for man.
When you've got a problem, think silicones. When you've got a question, think silicones. Because you see, silicones for GE are unquestionably the answer.
Now, you may not be the biggest fan of silicone out there, you may not be the biggest fan of musicals, but that's a pretty good song. Now, imagine if you were part of that silicone team, and now you'd be walking around the business, around your office, around the company floor, you'd be singing that song to yourself, taking pride in all the things that you've helped build. And I mean, they're being told that they helped with the moon landing. How could you not take pride in that? So these productions were for national and regional conventions of every sort of business, and it was just basically to help build a sense of community and pride in the company amongst their own employees. And that's a pretty amazing thought. As the documentary goes on, you find Steve found himself in a bit of a unique position, knowing and talking about this musical genre that almost nobody had ever heard of. And honestly, we're looking at him like he's crazy. Even his own family, as you'll hear here, thought he was making some of this stuff up.
I had been hearing the Bathrooms Are Coming as long as I can remember, but I didn't actually know what it was. I thought he had just kind of made it up.
I thought he made it up too.
And like it was this thing in our family.
Here's something that nobody cares about. Sorry. Back up.
I found out that it was part of a bigger thing later.
Yeah, that was a shock.
Now, like the best of documentaries, this one becomes a bit of a detective story. And as you watch, Steve realizes that there are clues to be found on the record sleeves and a lot of the small bits of paraphernalia and information he can find about these productions. And so he starts using those clues to lead him into other things, like he would find who was the cast and would try and find if he could make contact with some of those casts. And he does go on to interview many of the surviving cast members from these productions. And of course, this leads him to finding others who he had not been able to find, but those cast members are still in contact with, including some of the original writers of the music and the production scores. And that's where Steve becomes seriously interested. Now, I will say it becomes something like a treasure trove. Steve goes into these interviews with these cast members and people, and he kind of admits he was just looking for more stuff. He was looking for more records that he did not own, and he has a very substantial collection. But it leads him to kind of realize that these people were kind of special in their own right. And again, it's like the opening of a flower. What a beautiful story. You start realizing that everybody's a special little snowflake. But it is a kind of interesting thing that these people start talking about their own lives, their own aspirations. It's fantastic. And one of the genuine parts is where he's talking to some fellow collectors, and yes, there are fellow collectors of this stuff. And one of the collectors has found something he does not have, and they're just putting it on the record player. And it's just some small single that was released by one of these small companies that were passed out after the production to all their employees as a kind of thank you memento. And he's listening to it, and if you watch the clip, suddenly he hears something, and we don't know what it is. Although I will say we kind of work out later on that we know what he finds very interesting in these productions, and this warm, genuine smile just erupts over this guy's face as he notices something in this song that his knowledge, his extensive skill set about this very bizarre industry triggers inside of his head, and he recognizes something in that song, and it brings him such joy that this tiny little treasure has been unveiled before him. And it's just a very warm, very genuine part of the documentary, which is, again, another strength in documentaries. Normally you're getting real reactions, not scripted things like so much of our lives seem to be these days.
If the patient gets bloody,
I found some sort of treasure trove that we weren't supposed to know about at all.
It's the way. Yes, sir.
Everything's coming up, it goes.
I had no hobbies. I barely had any friends outside the show.
Now, the documentary moves on. He starts talking to, as I said, all these other collectors, and it's kind of interesting. You know, they're talking about productions, about the people who made these things, and in fact, Steve admits, like, he was talking to people he knew that knew musicals, no, not so much about the industrial musicals, and in fact, it was those who started recognizing some of the names he was talking about, and it suddenly occurred to him that these weren't just throwaway people that were creating this weird, bizarre little genre of musical that nobody ever saw again. These are actually pretty famous people. And it was these people who were going, you don't recognize those names? Those two people, well, they created Fiddler on the Roof. And this guy, he wrote Chicago. So these are serious Broadway musical talents that are creating some of these. Often they were doing it before they became famous, but often they were actually doing it while they were famous because it was a way of putting some cash in the bank. And there was a lot of money to be made here, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the main thing is Steve was listening to all this and listening to what other people were telling him about this little treasure he'd found, and he started to realize that there was something important here, and that's where the rest of the documentary takes off. And in fact, the book that Steve eventually writes, which I've got a copy here, let me just grab it. It is called Everything's Coming Up Profits, The Golden Age of Industrial Musicals. And it's been written by Steve Young and Sporty Murphy. And Sporty Murphy is actually pretty funny. He's in the documentary, and he does mention that
years trying to find other versions of this kind of thing, and then eBay came, and it was like a wonder of miracles. Here we go. But every time I found one, which was still pretty rare, I was always outbid by the same guy. He's just bought the same one 3 times in a row. I can't get near this stuff.
I think I only had the Arrow shirt record. And then another mutual friend and connoisseur of the incredibly strange said, yeah, I know that Arrow shirt record. I mean, there's somebody who really knows about that stuff. You need to meet this guy.
That, of course, turned out to be Steve, and eventually they would meet and talk and share records, and suddenly a tiny little community started to grow up around industrial musicals, and that's pretty amazing. Now, I'm just going to play a little clip here.
Hello.
Well, hi, Steve.
Hello, Sheldon.
Welcome to Casa Mia.
But I knew I've got to have as much of this as I can find.
Oh my God!
These are people who have changed American culture.
It was a dream job.
And there were a lot of them.
It was almost like having a door open to a secret society.
The general public had no knowledge of what was going on unless you were at one of these sales meetings.
This stuff is bizarre and hilarious. Those are only the beginning layers.
I think it has an unexpected importance that I would never have noticed when I was holding up the records on the show.
It illuminates an American business world that doesn't exist at all anymore.
Some of you out there might recognize some of those voices, some of you may not, but there were some serious stars involved in these musicals. You've just heard Mrs. Brady herself, Florence Henderson. You may have noticed David Letterman, and also Martin Short. Martin Short actually got his start in these and did quite a few of them. So a lot of quite heavyweight talent were attached to these. And I will say there is a clip in the documentary which I just adore. I just could not believe what I was watching. And it's the famous Hollywood actor Tony Randall. And Tony Randall, you can see him on stage. He's in one of these musicals. I have no idea what the company was. I'm trying to remember what product they were trying to sell. And it's just Tony Randall standing there, smiling, looking around himself like, what have I got myself into? And it's almost like he's lost. He doesn't know what's going on. But I will say he is intently listening to all the actors and all the singers that are dancing and bopping around him. And clearly you can see what's happened here is that this musical's shown up. They wanted to get somebody famous. They contacted Tony Randall. They've said, look, yeah, come in. You won't have to do much. We'll give you a couple of lines. You just have to know a couple of scenes, a couple of lines. Honestly, all the work is going to be done by the actors and the singers in this production. They're just going to move you from one scene to the next when you'll get your cue to come in and say your line. And so he's literally just bewildered standing in this stage, watching all this going around, hearing what they're singing about, like industrial solvents or dishwashers or ovens or whatever it was. And you can just see him going, what is this all? Just the way we are when we're listening to these songs, going, what am I listening to? And clearly he was just making some money, putting some money away. Now, Going back to what I said before, that I would come back to this, is why some of these productions had so many great people involved. There was a lot of money to be here. And in the documentary, one of the composers of several of these, a guy called Hank Beebe, estimated that the 1957 Chevrolet musical...
How much money are we talking about to put on one of these?
They spent a lot of money. The first Chevrolet show I did, the budget for that was $3 million.
And that was actually 6 times as much as it cost to put on My Fair Lady on Broadway that year. So these companies were spending a lot of money, and this was for just a short time. This was on a product that was never meant to be seen by anybody else, was only supposed to be a fleeting glimpse, would be put on display, put on stage, made maybe a small film of it, maybe eventually they made a record of it and they passed those on to their employees, and then that was it. It was never to be seen again. All that money, all that production gone in a fleet of an eye.
There's something about a show, if it's not being heard, then it's really gone. I feel a kinship with so many of these people. It's gone further than I've imagined.
So it's an amazing thing. And these things were costing a lot of money, and there was a lot of money to be made. So people were actually were building their lives around these, that they'd go from one show to the next, travel America, selling cars or plastic Tupperware. And yes, there is a Tupperware clip. It's just the most amazing thing to watch. And I was just sitting there, open wide, smiling, and a genuine smile. Just the way Steve was smiling when he heard that little piece in the song. I was sitting there smiling the whole way, that I just myself uncovered this tiny little gem of a micro industry that I knew nothing about, but I did know everything about. And that comes down to, it's easy to say, this is a documentary about the world of collectors. And if you've been a comic collector like I have, if you've worked in dinosaur museums like I have, you collect fossils, you collect books, you collect information, collecting becomes a big part of your life. And this is kind of what this documentary is about.
I hope everyone becomes interested in it. Yeah. Then I could sell the ones I don't care about for lots of money.
Capitalist pig.
Well, I learned that by listening to these records. I really got motivated to sell.
Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say you're not a fan of industrial musicals, but I bet you collected something and you will understand this world completely. If you like records, you've probably been into record shops throughout your life. Maybe in the old days you'd go into those record shops that have bins lining walls, and in the middle in rows and rows with every sort of music you can understand. But these aren't the bins we're talking about. If you look under those main record bins, often underneath, there were milk crates. Milk crates filled with the cheapest, nastiest, unsellable product you can imagine. And here is where Steve was finding his gold. He was looking through those sorts of bins and finding these bizarre records that nobody wanted, nobody even cared about, but he cared. And to him, they were small treasures, and he would go to the ends of the earth looking for these records.
If the patient gets bloody...
I found some sort of treasure trove that we weren't supposed to know about at all.
It's the way, yes, sir. Everything's coming out, it goes.
I had no hobbies. I barely had any friends outside the show. Hello.
Well, hi, Steve.
Hello, Sheldon.
Welcome to Casa Mia.
But I knew I've got to have as much of this as I can find.
Now, I'm sure if you're a collector out there, you've done the same thing. You've entered a store and you've asked for something that nobody there has ever heard of. Maybe a comic book, maybe a book, maybe a record, maybe a movie. And it becomes a very lonely journey that you kind of feel like you're out there by yourself looking for this small thing that nobody seems to ever heard of. And the flip side of that is occasionally you walk into somewhere where the person will go, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm a fan of that myself. And you will suddenly find yourself in a conversation about something that you've loved forever, but you've never had the ability to talk to anyone about, because often being a collector, the conversation is talking to somebody equal, not somebody where you're teaching somebody about this thing, because that's not a conversation, that's a lesson. And so entering these conversations with like-minded people who like like-minded things is a very empowering moment in your life. And that's, again, another thing that this documentary is about. It's kind of talking about community.
Oh my God!
These are people who have changed American culture.
And I love that part. I love the idea that even this weird bizarre industrial musicals has its own community. It has its own fan base where people have conventions where they go and meet once a year at some strange out of the way place and all sit around a hotel room every day talking about the records and showing off their collections. I kind of hope that is a thing, and I hope one day I get to go to one.
There are records that I know are out there that I do not have yet, and it's a little painful. I should have them all. I will have them all, eventually.
With all these sorts of things, there's always a bittersweet moment. Now, I thought long and hard about entering this one as a bittersweet moment, but having been around these industries for a long time, I'm going to say this is where it belongs. And that is the mania of collecting. And I think we all either have been possessed by it ourselves or we know somebody who is possessed, where they just have to have everything. And they will spend anything to get that everything, that they need a complete collection. And it does kind of take over their lives to a point that it's almost a disease. And it is like drinking and gambling and drugs. It can be taken too far. And let's face it, like collecting is a kind of gambling for many things, like comic books or baseball cards, anything like that. You do kind of always have one eye on the fact that in the future you could probably sell these things if you need to either make your money back or to maybe make a profit. So in a way it is kind of gambling and can be dangerous, can be addictive and dangerous like everything else. So if you're out there and you're listening, please, collect responsibly. That's my message for you. Other bittersweet moments, we are talking about an industry that was from the 50s and 60s, so obviously a lot of the people that were employed in these productions are either very old or dead. And in fact, Steve does get to interview a couple of people who then at the end you realise had died before the production had finished. And yes, that's a bittersweet moment because that's kind of a sad thing and yet kind of a great thing that before they died, they realised somebody had taken an interest in their work, that somebody was out there collecting and trying to promote them and trying to show the world that they were skilled and that their work was of value. And that is a very sweet thing to have done. Bittersweet that they may not have lived long enough to see the documentary and be able to show their families and their friends the documentary and show that their work had worth. But still, the ball was rolling, that they were being interviewed and maybe they went out with a bit of sense of pride. So that's pretty amazing. Now, the other one I will say is that it really does highlight the end of manufacturing in the West. That, this is certainly a first world problem here in Australia. It's happened a lot. Australia is one of the only first world nations now that doesn't have a car industry, that it's completely gone, that it was shut down by the government. It had been supported by the government for a long time, but they finally decided enough's enough. Stand on your own two legs or just go. And most of them went. I will say a lot of the jobs have been sent overseas to like Southeast Asia. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a thing that these people who relied on these jobs no longer have these jobs. So seeing all this stuff about these corporations who used to do so much for their employees and saw them as more than a resource, going back to the difference between then and today, not so much. Today, you're just part of the product line. They expect you to move on. You're expected to move on. And it's quite easy to move you on. But back then, these things were about careers. These were about lives. And also kind of introduces another reason why they probably started to disappear, which was not just the end of manufacturing, but the appearance of video. That in the 80s and 90s, no longer did you have to put on these big productions, that you could just have a small film company come in, film a little ad, film a little documentary or movie, which you could then shoot on video cassette or have it printed on cassette or CD or DVD, send them out to your companies all over the country, and they'd just sit down and watch those at their own leisure. So changing times. And it's always about changing times. Though I will say that the documentary does show that sometimes something old comes back again, and that a lot of corporations like Walmart actually are producing their own musicals again, which is kind of weird. What we know about Walmart, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Life can be so rich and wonderful when we step off the logical path and embark on eccentric adventures.
It'll change your life.
So there we heard from Steve again, and I will say I love that line so much that I'm stealing it, that I'm calling this Eccentric Adventures. And the documentary does end with a seriously heartwarming event that I don't want to give it too much away, but you will sit there, well, I sat there, with a wistful, happy smile on my face. And if you don't, then you're one tough nut, because I found it quite amazing that at the end, this event happens and it's quite beautiful. It's really enjoyable. I really enjoyed this documentary. So I hope you give this documentary a chance. I hope you go out and watch this very strange documentary about this very strange industry, and keep an eye on my podcast, because we will be doing some exciting things in the future. All right, thank you very much, and that's it for today. Eccentric Adventures is brought to you by Horror, the First Time America's Paranoia Infected the World, my own book on the 1950s war on comic books by international governments, and I hope you give it a read.
There's a new world opening up. There's a new world opening up. There's a new world opening up for the likes of me and you. There's a new day coming our way. There's a new day coming our way. There's a new day coming our way for the likes of me and you. Anywhere you travel, there's one thing that's the same. You'll always find a well-known sign, and that's the Xerox name. Any kind of language you may speak or hear, one thing sure, you'll find pure Xerox spoken here. There's a